what's the big challenge of education in Mexico, Professor?
Well, there are really, I suppose, many challenges. One of them is to overcome the inequalities in the educational system. And that seems to me to be a crucial matter, because what we tend to do is think about enrollments in education, and we try and make a system equal because everybody's enrolled. That is not really a very good definition of equality, because it does not take into account the poor distribution of quality in the system. So you can near 100% of primary school enrollment, for instance, but the quality of the primary schools will be so different in different places of the country, with, generally speaking, the poorest people having the poorest education, that it continues to be a very unequal system. This is true also with respect to the indigenous populations of Mexico, because, as you know, there is a fairly large indigenous population with lots of different groups, which is, again, similar to what you would have here in Brazil. So that's a huge challenge. I'll give you one more. It may be a kind of strange one. To my way of thinking, a huge challenge is for the Ministry of Education, or the Secretariat of Education, we call it in Mexico, to take back its responsibility for the educational system from the labor unions. In Mexico, the labor union is immensely powerful, and it, from time to time, it does not act in the best interests of the child, it acts in the best interests of its members. That is another challenge that seems to me to be a huge one.
The members are teachers?
Yes, yes. Teachers and other employees of the educational system. And in Mexico, it's one major union that has been given the right to be the only negotiator with the government, and it has immense power related to two things. One is that it can control a significant amount of the vote for president or governor or whoever. And second, because the heads of the union, to continue to do things that they do, receive 1% of the salary of every teacher in the country, which gives them quite a nice economic base to do all sorts of things that, again, help strengthen their power. Anyway, it's I think, something of a different situation. There are dissidents in the union, but they, in only one or two states of the country do they have any kind of significant voice. The main thing is that they can help to control educational policy. And I think we need to change that, which is not to be against unions. I think really unions have a very important role to play in defending the rights of their workers. But when the unions get involved in setting educational policy and establishing programs or recommending the establishment of programs, when they have control over, almost complete control over the hiring and firing of teachers, then it becomes a different thing.
But is there anything being doing to change the situation?
Well, in the political context, it's very difficult to do that. However, there are a number of groups in Mexico that are try to change the rules of the game between the ministry and the union. And there are small things that are being done that are changes that I think will add up over time. I think the indigenous education, to provide quality education that is at all levels, that is sensitive to the cultural diversity of the country, is another huge challenge. It's related to the equity situation, but here I would put more emphasis on the diversity and for bureaucracies to have multiple programs or to adjust their programs to differences in culture is hard for bureaucracies to do. So that remains a challenge.
Is that a question of money, to spend more money, or?
Well, in some way, maybe. I don't think more money will necessarily solve it, but I think additional resources for indigenous education would be an important part of the solution. But it's really almost more an attitude. For many years, and understandably, the education system in Mexico was directed toward forming a nation. So for indigenous groups, the process was to try and, in a sense, bring them into the national culture, and that meant getting them to speak Spanish. So the preservation of local languages was not a priority, and in fact to operate in the sort of larger national context, and people really do need to have Spanish. So the current attempt is to put emphasis on something is called bilingual, bicultural education. And I think there are some steps being forward in recognizing and being sensitive to the different local cultures. Quality is like a fish that you try and take with your bare hands out of the water, and you can't grab a hold of it. It always slips away. My own view of quality is that quality has many definitions. It does need to be adjusted to local contexts. Quality is much more than resources or buildings. And quality is not just outcomes. There is a tendency today to think that educational outcomes by some kind of standardized test will give us a good measure of educational quality. And I think that's only one piece of the picture. Why? First of all, children learn in many environments. They learn at home, they learn in the community, they learn in the church, they learn from the television. So a score on any test that a child takes is a product of all of those learnings. It's not just a product of the school. So to assign quality to an educational institution based on this test doesn't make sense unless you control for all these other kind of variables. My own way of thinking about quality has a different kind of origin. I like to start with thinking about the world in which I want to live. So if I want to live in a democratic world, then I want to create democratic citizens. And so I want to have children formed in a democratic way. But if a school is authoritarian, which most schools are, then it's difficult for that school to be quality because it has a kind of hidden curriculum that's teaching children to be authoritarian. If I want to live in a world that's a peaceful world, then I should not be hitting children in the school. And even though a child, let's say, might learn to read because I threatened the child or even punish the child, to my way of thinking, even though the child reads, and that's an outcome we want, and you might say that's a school of quality, I don't think it is, because the school is teaching that child something that is not consistent with the kind of world that I want to live in, and that I think in our discourse at least, in a democratic world, we don't want to find. So then if you define it that way, then you have to begin to look at some of the things in the classroom that don't normally get looked at. For instance, how does a teacher manage conflict in her or his classroom? Does she just separate the children, send one to the corner? Does she blame? Or does she have a process by which she tries to get the kids to talk and work out a solution between them? It's a different way of thinking about what quality is, I think.
We know that Mexico is very close to USA. The Mexican economy is very, I guess I could say, depend of the American economy. How does it affect the education in Mexico, Professor?
Well, it certainly affects the economy, and I suppose the economy is responsible for providing resources to education. So to the extent that the economy is not favorable, then obviously it will affect education. I have a suspicion that the greater effect on education than the economic one directly has to do with sets of imported values of what the television brings from the United States, of Disneyland, of Snow White and Mickey Mouse, rather than cultural traditions from Mexico. So I would say that is probably as great or greater influence on education than the economy per se. I think there's another one that does have to do with the relationship between the United States and Mexico, which is tied up to the drug trade, which has resulted now in a considerable level of violence, particularly in some parts of Mexico.
In the north? Especially in the north? Or?
Not only in the north. In Michoacan, which is in the center of the country, and on the western coast, in other, there's a high level of violence. And one of the things that has done is to put much more emphasis in all programs on security. And so within education, one of the programs that is now being instituted in schools is a program that is called a program of security. And on occasion, that means that you search the backpacks of children. It means that you may run your school in a different way that is not as open as it would be if you were not concerned about security. So that's another effect on education, but not on the content nor on the financing.
In 2000, in the year 2000, Mexico experimented a transition in politicians after 70 years, right? In education, did it change to a better situation? Did we have any change there?
Well, as you might have heard in the presentation I just gave here in the meeting, at the level of preschool, which is the field that I work in, in the period between about 2002 and 2007, when we looked at the quality of preschool education, we could not find a change. In fact, we found a slight decline in preschool education the way we defined it. And that was in spite of the fact that there were in fact a number of new initiatives under the new government which should have led to a change or improvement in education. For instance, there was curricular reform. There was something called a program called Schools of Quality, which was not only at preschool but at primary school and lower secondary. There was also a program of extending the obligatory education, which had been started from age 5 before, and now preschool was made obligatory from age 3, and I think in terms of the quality of education that probably lowered the quality, at least in the short run, even while it got much more kids into preschool. So I think it would be hard, in spite of the fact that there were a number of new programs at different levels, and these included introduction of a new technology in primary and secondary school, which was called Encyclomedia, in which there were large whiteboards that were electronic and could be used with kids. In spite of attempts to do that sort of thing, I think the overall education in Mexico really has not changed much since 2000.
The most of the students are at a public system or a private?
Most are in public system, yeah. And again, the figures I know best are at the preschool level, where 85% of the enrollments are in public education. And that's private education has increased from about 9 to 15% in the last, I don't know, 10 years, something like that. But it's still relatively low. In large cities, that can be a lot higher. That Mexico City has something like 35% of the kids in private preschools. At primary school, I'm not sure, but it's again, it's not a large percentage that are in private schools.
And how is to be a teacher in Mexico?
Teaching now for most people is a second or third choice career. It's not the first thing. That may be a little different in rural areas where the options are less. And that is so despite the fact that actually teachers in Mexico are paid relatively well compared to other countries in Latin America. And that has been a benefit that the powerful unions have been able to negotiate over the years. There was a recent study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development that did show that, in fact, if you relate the salary of teachers to the level of the per capita income in a country is a way of sort of adjusting and seeing where teachers' salaries are to the economy in general, that actually Mexico's not bad for teachers. What's it like to be a teacher? I think the teachers would tell you that the conditions are far from ideal in the public school system, that it is not uncommon for teachers to have a large number of children in their classrooms, and this makes it harder to teach. The resources may be more or less, but they're not outstanding, although this varies from place to place. So being a teacher demands, in fact, a lot of creativity and it's not an easy job, you know.
Yeah, when you talk in a large number of children in a class, how large it is?
Well,
in
let's say, if again talking about preschool, the national average is about 22 children for one teacher, but that's not very meaningful because there are some schools that have 8 children per teacher, and they're in rural areas and where the population is much more spread out. But in cities, it's not unusual for a teacher to have 30, 35 in preschool, and in primary school the numbers may be even higher than that. I think it's always been difficult to see how research is really used in educational systems, and there's a community of sort of academic researchers who really aren't particularly concerned about whether or not their research gets used in educational systems or not, because they're doing basic research. And I think that's legitimate. There's another kind of research that often involves evaluations of particular programs or particular systems or subsystems that probably has more effect on what happens in education. Sometimes it doesn't have an effect for a number of years, and the only reason it has an effect is because the government changes and somebody comes into a government position who knows about that research and say, hey, that's the way we should do it, and so all of a sudden it gets picked up. I think the amount of cases in which you say somebody does a piece of research and then that research is used immediately are not frequent. The meeting we've just had here, I think, is going in the right direction in the sense that there is a very important effort being made to involve government people along the way, so they learn not just after the research is done, but because they've participated in some way or other in the research, but also because a number of meetings like this one are being organized in which the mix of people is not just researchers talking to researchers, it's researchers and policy people and bureaucrats and school managers all mixed together discussing results of research. And the important piece or result of research is often that it pushes discussion in very constructive ways. There was a panel in this meeting with people from 6 different municipalities in which the research was carried out. I thought it was extraordinary. I thought it was a beautiful case in which you could actually see how each one of the municipalities was identifying its particular problems, pushed by evidence from the research, and in fact looking toward ways in which they could solve those problems. That's tremendous.
Professor, the last question is a personal question. You are born in the USA, right?
Right.
Why did you decide to go to Mexico and study education in Mexico? You live in Mexico.
No, that's an easy question to answer. It's because I married a Mexican woman and I'm much more portable than she is. So instead of having her come to live in the United States, I went to Mexico, and that's where I've been for 23 years. But I also enjoy living in Mexico. I think it is an extraordinary country. As Brazil, it's an immensely varied country, both in terms of cultures and in terms of the geography of the place. I think in general the Mexican people are a very warm people with a very nice tradition, and so I really do enjoy living there.
Professor, I would like to thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you.